Sometimes I think we have no real idea how spoiled we've become by modern conveniences. Honestly, most of us wouldn't last a single day in the Middle Ages. Life back then was harsh, and the food, well, that's a whole different kind of misery. If you imagine the past as endless feasts with roasted geese and overflowing tables, forget it. That kind of abundance was reserved for the wealthy, while ordinary folks lived on meager, repetitive meals that could be downright dangerous. The backbone of a peasant's diet was a thick stew made from whatever vegetables they could grow. It might simmer in the same pot for days until it lost nearly all its flavor. And sometimes, it contained things no one would want to find in their bowl: insects, bits of dirt, or grit. Bread was almost always on the table, but it wasn't the soft, fragrant loaf we enjoy today. Medieval bread was heavy, dark, and occasionally hazardous to your health. Flour was ground between stone mill wheels, which meant tiny stone fragments often ended up in the dough. People's teeth got strong not from a balanced diet, but from chewing bread that crunched like fine gravel. Worse still, rye flour could become infected with a fungus called ergot. Its toxic spores caused convulsions, strange visions, and sometimes death. Some historians believe mass poisoning from ergot was behind certain waves of witch hunts. Entire villages would start seeing signs of the devil where there were none. Meat was a rare luxury for the poor, and when they managed to get some, it was often already going bad. Refrigeration didn't exist. So eating it wasn't just a gamble with your stomach, but sometimes with your life. When meat started to turn, people had two options: drown it in expensive spices, if you were lucky enough to afford them, or just pinch your nose and hope your stomach didn't rebel. There was no middle ground. Hygiene rules were, well, let's just say, flexible. What we call the 5-second rule. Today? Back then, it was closer to the 5-day rule. And washing it down with water? Not a chance. That was practically a death wish. Most rivers, wells, and streams were swimming with waste, filth, and things I'd rather not picture. Instead, the safest drink around was beer or ale, not the high-alcohol versions we know today, but a much weaker brew. The magic was in the brewing process, which killed off dangerous bacteria. Historians estimate that an average peasant might drink around 8 pints a day. And this wasn't just for grown-ups, kids joined in too. By the time you were 5, you were probably sipping ale at every meal. Medieval children didn't need a fake ID to buy alcohol, they need one to get clean drinking water. Fish was also common, but unless you lived by the sea, it was rarely fresh. Most of it was preserved with salt, or dried until it was stiff as a board. Inland folk might wait days, sometimes weeks, for fish to arrive, and the smell alone could knock the air out of your lungs. And if you're already feeling queasy, perfect, because now we get to talk about bathrooms. For most people, indoor plumbing meant a chamber pot, which was literally just a bucket or bowl tucked under your bed. When it was full, you could carry it out yourself, or wait for someone to collect it. And where did the contents go? More often than not, straight out the nearest window, splashing down into the street below. Let's just say you learned very quickly not to walk too close to the walls. In medieval towns, the phrase, "watch out below," had nothing to do with falling flower pots. It was more about dodging something far less charming: human waste. The polite warning often came from an old French phrase that referred to water, though anyone living there knew it was anything but fresh. The routine was so common that in some cities, local rules stated you could only dump your chamber pot after 10 o'clock at night, as if darkness somehow made it better. If you happened to visit a castle, you might find a garderobe, essentially a stone bench with a hole, leading straight down the outside wall. In Dover Castle, archaeologists uncovered one that sent waste plummeting nearly 70 feet to the ground below. Even royalty didn't get special treatment in this department. A king's throne was still just a hole in a cold, drafty seat. And if nature called while you were away from home, your options were grim. Some towns had designated spots for public relief, which basically meant open sewers where people went in full view. London had a few common privies, built over rivers, but they were rare, and most folks didn't have access. The worst job, and oddly one of the best paid, belonged to the gong farmers. These poor souls spent their nights digging waste out of cesspits and hauling it outside the city walls. They earned about 4 times a normal laborer's wage, but the stench was so overpowering they were banned from public gatherings entirely. The smell of medieval cities was infamous. The Thames in London was so foul with sewage that people described it as a living monster of stink. And forget about toilet paper, that was centuries away. People wiped with whatever they could find: leaves, moss, scraps of cloth, or, for the wealthy, bits of wool or hemp. The Romans once had a surprisingly hygienic solution: communal sponges on sticks, cleaned in vinegar or salt water. But by medieval times, that bit of wisdom had been completely forgotten. After a full day of downing weak ale just to avoid catching something from the water, and then wandering around with no decent place to, well, handle your business, you'd probably be begging to teleport straight back to the modern world. But honestly, the bathroom nightmare was only one chapter in the long, exhausting book that was medieval life. Those dreamy stories about chivalrous knights or graceful ladies strolling through castle gardens? Pure fantasy for 99% of the population. The real medieval experience was sunrise to sunset labor, for just enough pay, or food, to keep going. The majority were peasant farmers, working land they didn't even own, answering to the local noble who collected rent in crops, coins, or both. Life's rhythm was brutally simple: wake at dawn, work until the light faded, collapse onto a straw mattress, repeat until your body gave out. Farming meant guiding wooden plows dragged by oxen, sowing seeds by hand, and cutting grain with small, crude sickles. Harvest season was the real test: 16 hours a day under a relentless summer sun, no breaks, no mercy. Historical records from England suggest that the average farm laborer burned over 4,000 calories a day purely through physical work. Forget gym memberships, surviving a random Tuesday was its own fitness program. If you weren't a farmer, you might turn to a trade, but those paths came with their own punishments. Blacksmiths stood in blazing hot forges all day, sucking in smoke and fumes, their skin and eyes at constant risk of burns. Tanners, who turned animal hides into leather, spent their lives working with vats of urine and harsh chemicals that dyed their skin yellow and left them with a stench no amount of washing could remove. And if you wanted to learn a craft, you had to start practically as a child. Apprenticeships often began at age 7, when kids were sent to live with a master craftsman. They'd work 6 or 7 days a week for up to 14 years before being considered skilled enough to move up to journeyman status. Medieval career guidance was simple. Can you lift heavy things? Great, you're a farmer. Can't? Then prepare for a life-breathing smoke or smelling like you've been bathing in a tannery. And if you couldn't manage the backbreaking labor of farming or a trade? Well, let's just say your career path was short, and so was your life. Some jobs existed purely because someone desperate enough would take them. There were link boys, usually poor children, whose task was to walk ahead of wealthy folks at night, holding a torch so they wouldn't trip in the dark. Then there were purifinders, who roamed the streets collecting dog droppings to sell to tanners for use in leather making. It wasn't glamorous, but if you were starving, it was a way to survive another day. And survive, really was the only goal. A day laborer in medieval England might earn a penny or two for a full day's work, just enough to buy maybe 2 loaves of bread. The idea of a minimum wage didn't exist. Instead, there was a grim standard, the absolute minimum needed to keep you alive long enough to finish tomorrow's shift. With punishing work, bad diets, and little rest, bodies wore out fast. Sickness was everywhere, and real medicine was practically non-existent. In fact, most treatments were more like creative torture than healthcare. Medieval WebMD had just one outcome for every symptom: you're probably going to die. Something as simple as the flu, something we now knock out with bed rest and over-the-counter meds, could take your life. Without any understanding of germs or bacteria, people believed disease came from bad air, or from an imbalance in the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Got a fever? Time to drain some blood. Bloodletting meant slicing open a vein and letting it pour into a bowl, the belief being you simply had too much of it. Doctors were confident in this cure, applying it to everything from headaches to infections. Leeches were also popular, tiny, squirming assistants who'd help drain you without the need for a blade. Leeches were a go-to remedy, slapped right onto the skin to draw out bad blood. Some medical texts even suggested using up to 70 at once for certain illnesses. Unsurprisingly, death from disease was everywhere. Around a third of all children never made it past age 5, and most adults were lucky to reach their mid-30s. The Black Death alone wiped out about half of Europe's population in the 14th century. Teeth were another nightmare. Without proper brushes or any real dental care, decay was almost inevitable. Medieval dentists didn't take appointments. They simply waited until someone's screams could be heard across the village. The few medicines they did have could be worse than the illness. Mercury, for example, was prescribed for everything from rashes to syphilis, and it could kill you quicker than the disease itself. And hygiene? Forget it. Hand cleaning often meant wiping your palms on already filthy clothes, about as effective as cleaning a muddy boot with another muddy boot. Even if you somehow escaped the medical horrors, life still had more challenges in store. Justice back then wasn't just blind, it was cruel, unpredictable, and entirely dependent on where you were. Laws could change from one town to the next, meaning what was legal in one village might land you in a dungeon just a few miles away. In the Middle Ages, there was no universal legal code, and most ordinary people had no clue what actually counted as a crime, at least, not until they were accused. Your Miranda rights basically boiled down to being told you were in trouble, and that was it. Punishments were wildly disproportionate. Steal a loaf of bread because you're starving? You might lose a hand. In England, more than 200 offenses could earn you the death penalty, and many were shockingly minor. Trials were nothing like modern courtrooms. One method, the ordeal by iron, forced the accused to carry a red-hot metal bar for several feet. If the burn healed cleanly in 3 days, you were innocent. If it became infected, and without medicine it almost always did, you were guilty. Another was the ordeal by water. Bound and thrown into a river, you were considered innocent if you sank, guilty if you floated, at which point execution followed. The reasoning was that pure water would reject the guilty. Either way, it was a lose-lose. For those found guilty, executions were public and meant to terrify. Hanging was considered merciful compared to punishments like drawing and quartering, where the condemned was dragged through the streets, partly hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and then chopped into 4 parts. Crowds gathered for these events as if attending a festival, bringing food and drinks to watch the spectacle. Entertainment in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly diverse. You could either stay home and stare at the wall, or head out to watch an execution. Most people chose the latter. Nobles, of course, played by different rules. If accused of a crime, they could demand trial by combat and hire a skilled fighter to take their place. Wealthy offenders could even pay blood money to the victim's family to avoid punishment entirely. For the poor, there was virtually no defense. You simply took whatever sentence was handed down. Prisons weren't meant for serving time. They were temporary holding pits until your punishment. These dungeons were dark, cramped, and filthy, with prisoners chained to walls or floors. The state didn't feed you, survival depended on family bringing food. Torture was part of the legal process, used to get confessions whether true or not. The rack stretched limbs until joints popped, the Iron Maiden enclosed victims in a spiked coffin, and thumbscrews crushed fingers. Under such pain, most confessed to anything, which almost always ended in execution. For lesser crimes, humiliation was the preferred weapon. The stocks locked your head and hands in place while the public pelted you with rotten food, mud, and worse. Women accused of gossip or nagging their husbands risked the ducking stool, strapped to a chair and dunked repeatedly into water until they gave up or passed out. Medieval justice was as simple as it could be. Cities hired night watchmen, often elderly men or those who could no longer perform heavy labor. Their main duty was to keep order and raise the alarm if they noticed a fire or crime. These watchmen did not make official arrests or read rights. If they saw someone committing a crime, they would usually shout, "Stop, thief!" and hope that passers-by would help by tripping the suspect or blocking their escape. Catching criminals depended largely on the quick response of local residents, rather than on any official procedures. A mere accusation of a crime could ruin a person's reputation and future. The principle of innocent until proven guilty did not exist. It was the opposite. Once you were accused, you were effectively considered guilty, and it was up to you to prove your innocence, often by undergoing dangerous and humiliating trials. If you managed to survive the justice system, other dangers awaited you, such as war. Medieval wars bore little resemblance to the romanticized battles we see on screen. There were no neat rows of shining knights galloping across open fields. Real battles were dirty, chaotic, and almost always deadly for ordinary soldiers. Armed conflict was a constant reality. For example, the 100 Years' War between England and France lasted from 1337 to 1453, a total of 116 years, with some breaks. It was common for a medieval person to live through several wars, which is in stark contrast to modern life, where many people never encounter combat. As for armor, only the wealthiest knights could dream of owning a full set. The cost of armor was so high that by today's standards it would be equivalent to buying an expensive sports car, unaffordable for ordinary soldiers, who had to make do with cheaper and much less protective equipment. A full suit of plate armor in the Middle Ages could cost a skilled craftsman the equivalent of 2 or 3 years' wages. Most foot soldiers couldn't even dream of owning one. Instead, they wore thick padded jackets known as gambesons, which offered minimal protection. If they were lucky, they might sew on a few small metal plates for extra defense. Fully armored knights were the medieval equivalent of someone cruising around in a flashy sports car, rare, expensive, and a bit of a status statement. As for weapons, swords were high-priced items mostly reserved for the nobility and professional warriors. Ordinary fighters made do with spears, axes, or repurposed farm tools. One of the deadliest weapons of the time wasn't a sword at all but the longbow. It could punch through most armor at close range, making it a fearsome equalizer on the battlefield. English longbowmen began training from a very young age, and years of drawing bows with over 200 pounds of pull left many of them with twisted spines and enlarged arm bones. Medieval battles were brutally deadly. Take the Battle of Towton in 1461. Around 28,000 men were killed in just one day, roughly 1% of England's male population at the time. Many soldiers never even reached the fighting, freezing to death in a snowstorm before clashing with the enemy. And surviving the battlefield didn't guarantee safety. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, even small wounds often turned fatal from infection. But for peasants, the real nightmare wasn't the battle itself, it was the in-between. Armies fed themselves by stripping the countryside bare, taking food, animals, and supplies from nearby villages. This living off the land often meant torching fields, slaughtering livestock, and burning homes to the ground. It didn't matter which side they fought for, both armies plundered mercilessly, leaving civilians hungry and homeless. In the Middle Ages, supporting the troops often meant praying they wouldn't steal all your food and burn your home to the ground. Sieges were among the most terrifying parts of warfare. When an army surrounded a fortified town or castle, the people trapped inside faced weeks or months of slow starvation. During the siege of Paris in 885 to 886, hunger became so desperate that residents ate rats, cats, and eventually turned to cannibalism. Some sieges dragged on for incredible lengths. The siege of Candia in the 1600s holds the record at 21 years. Disease was an even deadlier enemy than the opposing army. Cramming thousands of soldiers together in filthy conditions with scarce food and dirty water created a breeding ground for illness. In the Crusades, European forces often lost half their numbers to sickness before even reaching the battlefield. Medical care for soldiers was laughably primitive. Minor injuries got the rub some dirt on it treatment, while anything serious meant preparing for the end. For civilians, war zones offered only grim options. Fleeing meant leaving behind everything you owned and possibly starving along the way. Staying put meant risking violence, looting, and worse from whichever army passed through. Medieval records tell of entire villages wiped out, with no distinction between men, women, or children. Even if you avoided conscription, escaped the pillaging soldiers, and didn't starve from famine, you still had to deal with daily life, and that began with the stench. Medieval towns were an overwhelming mix of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, the harsh smell of tanning vats, slaughterhouse scraps, and thick smoke drifting from countless hearths and open fires. With no organized garbage removal, refuse simply piled up in the streets or got dumped into the nearest river. Butchers often discarded animal guts and blood right outside their shops, adding to the already nauseating atmosphere. The stench could be so overpowering that people carried small pouches of fragrant herbs, called pomanders, to hold under their noses. In other words, the medieval air freshener was just something that smelled slightly less awful than everything else. Personal hygiene was another story altogether. Most people only bathe a few times a year, usually once in spring and again toward the end of summer. Many believed that bathing opened the pores and made the body more vulnerable to disease. In winter, it was common to go 4 or 5 months without washing at all. Head lice were so widespread that special combs to remove them were a regular part of grooming. If medieval dating profiles had existed, only moderate lice infestation might have been considered a genuine selling point. Clothing was rough, uncomfortable, and rarely cleaned. Underwear was typically made from coarse linen that rubbed against the skin, while outer garments were heavy wool that itched constantly. Both peasants and nobles generally owned just 2 or 3 outfits, which were worn until they literally fell apart. Footwear was made from thin leather with flat soles, offering little to no protection against cold or wet conditions. Even the language would be a challenge. Middle English from the 1400s sounds almost like a foreign tongue to modern ears. You'd have trouble understanding them, and they'd likely think you were speaking nonsense. As for privacy, it didn't exist. Most families lived in a single-room home where everyone worked, ate, and slept together, with no walls or doors to separate daily life. Beds in the Middle Ages were often communal. Entire families slept together, and in roadside inns, it wasn't unusual to share a bed with complete strangers. Even in the homes of the wealthy, true privacy was rare. Servants were almost always nearby, even during moments you preferred to be alone. Entertainment was limited and often bloody. Public executions drew massive crowds and were treated like major events. Animal baiting, pitting dogs against chained bears or bulls, was a popular pastime. On calmer days, people might enjoy a traveling entertainer or hear stories from a bard, but these diversions were infrequent. The social structure was rigid under the feudal system. Nearly 90% of people were peasants with no property, working land owned by nobles. Moving up the social ladder was almost unheard of, and changing one's trade or role in society was rare. With little access to formal education, superstition filled the gaps left by ignorance. Many believed in witches, demons, and mythical creatures. Illnesses were blamed on evil spirits, foul air, or the alignment of planets. A solar eclipse could spark mass panic, with people convinced the world was ending. Fact-checking usually meant asking the oldest villager if they remembered something similar happening before. Communication moved at the pace of a person on foot or horseback. News from a nearby town could take days, while information from another country might take months, if it arrived at all. By the end of this tour through medieval realities, you'd be desperately wishing for a one-way ticket back to the present, with its medicine, clean water, privacy, and deodorant. Books and films may romanticize the past, but the truth is that life in the Middle Ages was an unrelenting struggle that most modern people wouldn't last through for even a single day.